Taccia Akasakura, a Jekyll and Hyde ink. In this ink swatch, which ink is the oxblood and which is the ink on showcase today?
Well, today, folks, we're looking at Taccia Akasakura. This is one of those inks where the real magic only starts appearing once pen meets paper. This is not your look at me, I'm a bright red type of ink. This is more of a deep, theatrical, slightly moody Japanese red, almost like someone took cherry blossom petals, mixed them with old theatre curtains, and added just a little bit of drama. The name Akasakura refers to a traditional Japanese color, a rich, reddish tone with subtle purple undertones, and the color was directly inspired by the kimono artwork on the box. And that's kind of what makes this ink cool. It isn't just, here's a red ink. There's actually an art and historical connection behind it. Taccia describes it as reflecting the bold elegance of the Edo period. And yeah, that's pretty accurate. The ink feels dramatic without being loud. It's refined drama. Now, swatching on Yu-Sari and writing on Yu-Sari is something totally different. Now let's move on to Yu-Sari paper. And this combo is really good. Yu-Sari already has that slightly softer, more natural presentation compared to ultra-coated papers, and Akasakura looks incredibly elegant on it. When swatching, the first thing you notice is the shading. You get those layered transitions from soft rose red into deeper wine red edges. The pooling becomes really visible, especially in broader swabs, and because Yu-Sari isn't overly glossy, the ink looks more organic and paintery. Writing-wise, this is probably one of my favorite combinations for this ink. Fine nibs look clean and readable, but with an ox blood look to it, which is different to what you expect from the bottle. But once you move into medium or broad nib territory, the ink completely wakes up. Medium nib is honestly the sweet spot. You get enough ink flow for proper shading without turning every word into abstract expressionism. Broad nibs though, that's where the theatrical side appears. The ink starts looking like tiny brush strokes, and if you use a stub nib, forget about it. At that point, you're basically writing kabuki scripts. Drying time on Yu-Sari is reasonable, although definitely not fast. If you're left-handed and emotionally attached to smudge-free pages, this may test your character development. But overall, it is an excellent pairing. How swatching on Tomoe River Machine 9 and writing on Tomoe River Machine 9 performs. Alright, now this is where things get dangerous. Tomoe River Machine 9 paper absolutely flexes its ink shading capability. This paper already has a reputation for making fountain pen inks look ridiculous, in the best possible way, and Akasakura takes full advantage of it. Swatching on Machine 9 immediately shows more tonal separation. You start seeing pink undertones, deep crimson pooling, darker edges, and subtle complexity that almost disappears on cheaper paper. The ink suddenly feels more alive. This is also where you may notice slight sheen in heavier applications, depending on the lighting. Not massive sheen, this isn't turning into a disco glitter ink, but enough to add depth. Writing performance is excellent. The slightly drier flow of the ink actually works well on Tomoe River because the paper itself keeps the lines crisp. Though I must say, with a fine nib, the lines are very thin and you may struggle with a semi-dry nib. There is no feathering, no nonsense, just clean, dramatic shading. Again, a medium nib is probably the safest recommendation for most people. But broad and stub nibs on Tomoe River are absolutely beautiful. The line variation becomes insane. Every word starts looking intentional and artistic, and every grocery list suddenly looks like it belongs in a museum. The only downside is dry time, and yes, it can get slow, very slow. The swatching that I made took 30 minutes to dry. That is half an hour to dry with swatching, and the writing times are 25 plus seconds. Depending on the nib and paper combo, with that stub nib, that was closer to a minute. on Rhodia. The moment the ink hits the page, you notice how smooth and controlled it looks, almost like the paper is giving the ink space to show off properly. In a finer nib, I get this deep cherry red tone with hints of brown underneath, almost like dried rose petals or old lacquer. But when you move into broader nibs, especially stubs, the inks open up completely. Suddenly you start seeing these warmer pink and crimson tones that make the color feel alive instead of flat. And Rhodia really helps with that, because the coating keeps the ink sitting a little more on the surface. You get cleaner shading and more visible variation between light and dark areas. It doesn't feather, it doesn't get messy, it just looks elegant. What I enjoy most is that Akasakura isn't trying to be the loudest red ink in the world. It's not neon. It's not screaming for attention. It has this quieter artistic character to it that slowly grows on you the longer you write with it. Swatching on Clairefontaine and writing on Clairefontaine gives a slightly different experience. Compared to Yu-Sari and Tomoe River, Clairefontaine tends to make inks appear cleaner, sharper, and slightly more saturated. So Akasakura looks a little bolder here. The shading is still present, but slightly tighter and more controlled. Swatching looks very polished and almost formal, like the ink put on a suit before arriving. You get that beautiful tonal variation, but the transitions are smoother and less dramatic than on Tomoe River. Writing-wise, Clairefontaine handles the ink extremely well. There's no feathering, no bleeding, and very crisp edges. Feathering may be seen on a very broad and very wet nib. However, on a fine and medium, there is no feathering. And because the paper is bright white, the reddish tones stand out more strongly. This is probably the best setup if you want to use the ink professionally without losing its personality. Fine nibs remain very usable here. Medium nib still looks best overall. Broad nibs look gorgeous but can start pushing the dry time a little. And stub nibs, still incredible, still dramatic, still making your handwriting look more expensive and expansive than it actually is. Honestly, Clairefontaine probably gives the most balanced daily use presentation of this ink.
The thing I really appreciate about this ink is that its water resistance is a little more nuanced than just waterproof or not waterproof. When you first see the ink on the page, especially on smoother papers like Rhodia, it almost looks too soft and elegant to survive water at all. It has that warm cherry red tone with delicate shading, so you'd expect everything to vanish the moment water touches it. But interestingly, that's not entirely what happens. If you run water over fresh writing, you definitely lose some of the brighter red dye. The top layer starts to wash away pretty quickly, and you'll see the color soften and spread. So this is not one of those inks that laughs at water. But underneath the brighter red layer, there's usually still enough left behind to keep the writing readable. Not perfectly crisp, more like a faded memory of the original line, but still visible enough that your notes probably won't be completely lost.
In closing, the connection between the artwork of kabuki theater inspiration and the actual color itself feels intentional rather than gimmicky. Performance is excellent, shading is the main attraction, and the slightly drier flow actually helps keep the ink controlled and expressive. If you like heavy saturated modern reds, this may feel too restrained, but if you appreciate subtle complexity, artistic shading, and inks with personality, this ink is fantastic, especially in medium, broad, or stub nibs. This is one of those inks that rewards slowing down and actually looking at your writing for a second, which is dangerous because suddenly you've spent 45 minutes writing absolutely nothing important just to admire the shading.